How do you turn a tough piece of beef into something so fashionable and so tasty? That's what we're going to be working on today. It's a recipe that's called a la mode beef or beef a la mode, and it is really actually quite old, 1650, and yet 150 years later, it shows up 3 different times in this tiny little American cookbook from 1797. This recipe does some fun things with this beef that turns it into something that is so tasty and so good. When we think of the term a la mode, we think of something like, a pie a la mode, which has ice cream on it, but really a la mode just means, very fashionable, a fashionable way of cooking something particular. So we've got beef, and beef, especially in our 17th and 18th century time period, can be tough. Cattle are not grown the same way today as they were in the time period. Their cattle are all out in the field, they're running around, they have tough muscles and very little fat. And so beef isn't actually a high-end kind of meat in the time period. So how do we turn this very tough beef into something that is a fashionable and tasty dish, something you can put on the table of an expensive and well-to-do household? In the 1650s, a very famous French cookbook came out, and almost immediately it was translated for the English because the English were really interested in French cookery. So this very first English recipe for beef a la mode goes something like this. Beat it well and lard it with great lard. Then seethe it in a pot with good broth, a bundle of herbs, and all kinds of spices. And when it is well consumed or well cooked, serve it with a sauce. Now this is a very, very simple recipe here. But as we go through the 18th century, this recipe gets more and more complex. The recipes fill up an entire page because they're getting more interested in how we can get more of these flavors in here. This doesn't give us very many descriptions. Put a whole bunch of spices in there, and that's about it. We're gonna have fun with this one. We're gonna work directly from a 1796, 1797 recipe and kind of do it exactly the way this person in America thought that beef a la mode should be done. She says, take a round of beef and stuff it with a half a pound of pork, a half a pound of butter, the soft half of a loaf of wheat bread, boil 4 eggs very hard, chop them up, add sweet marjoram, sage, parsley, summer savory, 1 ounce of cloves pounded, chop them all together with 2 eggs very fine, add a gill of wine, season very high with salt and pepper, cut holes in your beef and put your stuffing in. Then stick the whole with cloves into the beef and then put it into a 2-pail pot with the sticks in the bottom. If you wish to have the beef round when it's done, put it into a cloth and bind it up tight with 20 or 30 yards of twine. Put it into your pot with 2 or 3 quarts of water, 1 gill of wine. If the round be large, it will take 3 or 4 hours to bake. Now the other recipes in here are kind of similar. We have this beef here and we are stuffing it with flavor and with fats because the beef by itself isn't that great. Now this cookbook is fascinating. This is the first cookbook written by an American for America. So America had other cookbooks that were printed, but they were just English cookbooks they just came over and printed in America. This is the first one that's adapted to American tastes and to American ingredients. And we have all sorts of interesting things showing up in here. Uses for corn. The first time we see the recipe for cookies. The first time we have Indian bread pudding. This is a really important recipe book for understanding cookery in early America. And here it is with beef a la mode, 3 different ways. One of the interesting concepts that happens in this particular recipe is larding. And we see that showing up in a lot of different recipes in the 18th century. I don't know if very many people talk about it today and what goes on. It does sometimes take a special piece of equipment or a special technique. And it's how do we get something like they would call it bacon in the time period or lard into a piece of tough beef here. We've got raw beef, and we want to put lots of fat into it because a lot of cuts of beef don't have a lot of marbling. They don't have a lot of natural fat in there. And that is where the flavor and the tenderness comes from in beef. And so I've got something here. I made up this little larding needle, and a larding needle in this time period, sometimes it was just a needle, and they would thread lard into it and put it through the meat and drag the lard in. Now that's really hard to do. Our lard or bacon today wouldn't come along. It would just break up. And in this case, we're making a force meat or something almost like sausage, and we need to get it inside of the meat. We've got this tool here that we can pack full of our sausage or our force meat, and then we can put it into the meat and then push it in so that it fills up the meat. We are stuffing the meat full of our sausage. They're using huge chunks of meat, something that might be a 14 or 15 pound piece of meat. We're not going to be cooking anything nearly that big, so I've cut down all these amounts to make the proper quantity. For our force meat, we're going to use chopped up pork or ground pork. We're going to put butter in here. We've got our chopped herbs. We also have a chopped up boiled egg, along with some regular spices like salt and pepper and cloves. And some recipes might even use a little bit of nutmeg. One of the other ingredients here that makes a classic stuffing are breadcrumbs, or the crumb, or she calls it the soft of a loaf of bread. We're going to mix this into a nice soft sausage consistency, and then we're going to inject it into the beef. It can be tricky getting all the stuffing in. We may or may not use as much. Depending on the size of the piece of beef you're working with, you'll kind of know how much you can get in there. This has a special cooking method that's a little different than the vast majority of recipes we see in 18th century cookery. It's a common theme on all of these that they get cooked in a pot. So we put them inside a pot and then it gets covered, probably halfway up with liquid. And in this particular recipe, she talks about putting sticks, or in another one of her recipes, bones underneath the piece of meat, between the bottom of the pot and the meat, so that there is liquid underneath it. She doesn't want to get the very bottom of this meat sort of seared or burnt or hard in any way. So it's suspended in the liquid. If we put this into a modern oven, or say into our earthen oven, it's not going to get too much more hot underneath than it would anywhere else, so that's not a particular problem. We're using a low and slow cooking method on this. In a modern oven, you would place this in at about 300 degrees. Make sure the lid is on nice and tight and put it in there and let it go. Even one this size could take easily an hour and a half or 2 hours, maybe even 3 hours, depending on just how deeply cooked you wanted it. But with the lid on and all that liquid in there, it really can take quite a while, and it gets very, very tender. Our a la mode beef is out of the Dutch oven. It smells wonderful. Even just bringing it up and cutting it, you could tell it was nice and tender. Now the real test is, what does it taste like? Let me get a little piece of this, a little bit of the stuffing, a little bit of the meat, both together. This is perfect. The best way. You can see why this shows up in so many different cookbooks. So good. The beef flavor is wonderful, and it's very offset by adding all those great fats from the sausage and the butter and the spices. They all come together and make a wonderful combination and a great dish.